Hello, my name is Denise Lindeman, and I'm one of the members here at Desert Grace. I'm excited to share this Sunday message with you. Would you take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel? And if you like this video, be sure to give us a thumbs up so that we know you've been blessed. You can do those things below.
Find ourselves after Easter, having talked a lot about a cross, wanted to kind of enter in a different kind of sermon series and talk a little bit about some of the different crosses you come across in the New Testament. And we'll get into that here in a minute. You might understand later. But I've thought about this a lot. And it seems to me like it is rather unlikely that most of us really recognize how much symbolism there is in our everyday lives. That there are symbols all around us, that we recognize these symbols, we understand these symbols, we know exactly what these symbols mean in the minute that we see them. And I thought about this for a while, and I said, what kind of symbols do we normally relate to the most? And I thought, what about logos? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a test. I want to figure out if you can follow along with some logos that are basically symbols. You got that one really fast, see? And it's just a symbol. It does not say Disney anywhere on it. Where do you see Disney? Shall what? See? Symbols. Here's another symbol that you might recognize. I tried to pick easy ones. I guess I made it too easy. My goodness. The next one. You can't shout it out since you get to see them first. All right. Oh, how'd that get in there? Whoa. Who put that there? Not all symbols are logos. There's other kind of symbols that we see all around us. I'm afraid to do it too fast. This is how you know which door to go into, right? It's a symbol. It's a symbol that tells you that. See? Did you think about all this? Like, I could keep going on and on and on and on and on with all the different symbols that you would happen to come across in your everyday life. Karen at Desert Grace. Universal signal for pause. What do we learn from the symbol of the cross? Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about Levi today, who we also know as Matthew. Specifically, what is it that when we see a symbol of a cross, that he will specifically be able to say, that's my story? Because the reality is that all of us have a journey towards Christ, and all of us have a story that is represented in some sort of cross. And I kind of want you to be thinking over the course of the next few weeks, what would your cross look like? What exactly is it made of? What does it ultimately contain? The Christian cross is a symbol, and while you can find all different variations and versions, and if you're not careful, you will see crosses in everyday items, like a telephone pole. You will find that the cross can be very comforting, perhaps. That you might just be driving down the road and see a church and see a cross or see a monument and be just reminded of the goodness of God. Hey, that's the incredible part of a symbol. No two journeys to the cross are ever the same. If you and I were able to sit down and talk, while there might be a few similarities, we would discover that God has worked through both of us in incredibly different ways. And it is so important that we understand that. It's so important. So behind every one of us, there is a story. And behind every cross, there's a story. I told you I want you to think over the next few weeks about what your cross would look like. And as you're probably already kind of thinking through that, or maybe you're just like, I still don't get it. I just want you to begin to understand that the symbol of the cross, if we are Christians, is our symbol. And it's important that we get this. Matthew 9, verses 9 through 13. If you have a NIV Bible particularly, it titles this whole section, The Calling of Matthew, or The Calling of Levi in other versions, in other Gospels. It says this. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Not come. Lots of things there. Almost always when we talk about Jesus calling somebody, we talk about the fishermen he calls. That he goes and he finds some guys off fishing and then calls them and says, "Come and follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." But besides fishermen, Jesus called at least one IRS agent to be within his inner circle. Not to just be a follower, not just to be like somebody who's part of the crowd, but to be a close friend, a confidant, somebody who he would give all of his teaching and pour all of his life into. It's important that we understand this. It's important that we get it. It's really a scene that we may not be familiar with. Some scholars say that most likely Levi, Matthew, might have been at an outdoor market. There might have been a lot of commerce going on, and part of what he could have been doing there is possibly selling rights to other people to go and collect taxes. So that he would potentially even be able to say, all right, I'll sell you the rights to go collect taxes on that property or on that person and all of those sorts of things. But that could possibly be where Jesus walks up in the middle of a transaction while he's discussing with somebody whether or not they would be one of his people. If he wasn't collecting taxes, that is. And if he was collecting taxes, we know that often the tax collectors sort of made up any amount that they wanted. And there was a certain amount they needed to give to the government, of course. There had to be somebody that was kept happy, and yet at the same time, they could go in and say whatever they wanted to say, and you would probably have to pay it. The tax man would be among the most despised in the community. I don't know if that's still true. I've never heard of anybody who said, "Yay, the IRS is coming." But he would have been just absolutely looked down upon. The worst of the worst. The people that don't have any friends, really, except other tax collectors. I thought about this, and I've heard this said before, that we'd pay a lot less taxes if it worked this way, but if instead of, say, an employer pulling the money out of your check and distributing your tax to the proper authorities on their own, if you had to go get your paycheck at one window and then go to the next window and pull out the cash and then go to the next window and give cash to the tax collector, that poor guy. Imagine what that would be like. Now, we have a different formula, and, it comes out, and then we do a really pretty complicated tax form to decide whether or not we've paid enough or not. And sometimes we get to say, woo, I get some money back, which really means you just overpaid, usually. Or you got to pay the tax man, and you know that feeling if you've ever had to pay? That's what you'd be feeling if you saw Matthew. That's what you would think when you saw him. If you could then find out that tax collector could add his own surcharge so that he has enough to cover what you really owe, plus, buy a BMW or something. Do some home improvement, add, gold-plated something. You would not be really fond of this person. In fact, you would probably walk by and mutter something under your breath every time you saw him. And in fact, if he was ever brought up at your dinner table, it would not be in kind and lovely terms. Right? I mean, just really. The person that would be that person who we would have to pay taxes to would be not just strongly disliked. We would hate that person. That's kind of how we would be. We're humans, after all, right? We might be able to go, all right, yeah, you're just doing your job. But then we'd walk away and go, jerk. That's Levi. That's who he was as a person. And that's what people were seeing. That is exactly what was going on here. The Jews would have hated Levi not just because he was the tax man. That would be bad enough to be hated anyway. But not only was Levi the tax man and was this person, he would associate with Gentiles. And of course, Gentiles are unclean. Ceremoniously, Levi as a Jew would be a problem here, because he's hanging out with the wrong people. He would also be handling the wrong kind of money. And so he is not only the most despised person because he is the tax collector, he's also really disliked by the Jews because he is not a clean person because of all of these realities. He would be considered a tremendous outsider. So he's hated all around. Jesus finds this despised, lowly person, and in his typical, really long-winded request for somebody to follow him, he says, "Come and follow me." Now, I don't know about you, but if I happen to be walking next to Jesus and we came across the tax collector and Jesus stopped to talk to him, I would be getting ready to just really absolutely hope that Jesus is going to give him a piece of his mind. Right? I mean, isn't that what you would really kind of hope for? Oh, now this is Jesus, who, by the way, we believe is the Messiah already. There's something special about this guy. He's really going to let this tax man have it? I'm so excited. And he opens his mouth and he says, "Hey, follow me." No. Jesus, that's the tax man. Yep. You just brought the IRS into the circle. We didn't need him on the board.
There you go.
Right? And that's what we'd be thinking. But Levi hears the call of Jesus, and he doesn't say, "Well, let me think about that for a little bit." He immediately obeys. When you look through the accounts of the calling of the disciples, this is usually how it goes. You have something like "come and follow me," and then you have obedience. Here the tax man obeys Jesus. I want us to really pay close attention to that, because I told you already that fishermen we are used to talking about, and we're used to them following Jesus. Now we have the taxman following Jesus. And I also told you that we all have a different way to come to the cross, but I got to kind of start to believe this, that it all begins with follow me. Yeah. It all begins with follow me. The story kind of leaves something out, I'm convinced, because according to the story, Jesus says, come follow me, and he ends up at Matthew's house for a big dinner. Something in there we missed. I'm pretty confident of it. But that's not the point. It's not a point how he ended up at Matthew's house for dinner. Scholars are going to tell you that most likely the dinner at Matthew's house was a banquet put in Jesus' honor. If you read through the other Gospels, Luke 5:29 makes this abundantly clear. Matthew doesn't quite really. He wrote the book and didn't quite say, here's how we ended up over at my house. I wanted to throw a party for Jesus. But Luke doesn't mind saying, Matthew throws this banquet in Jesus' honor. And so what does Matthew do? He invites all of the religious experts to come in. No, that's not how the story went. What did he do? We read it. He invited his tax collector buddies. It said the people at the party, there were many tax collectors. Now, I don't know about you, but one tax collector is enough. Many? Remember, these are the despised people. And Matthew's just saying, hey, y'all, come on over. Gonna throw a party for Jesus. Tax collector's probably pretty wealthy, by the way. Probably a pretty good party. The people at the party, according to the story that Matthew wrote, included sinners. Ooh. Now, you got to understand that when Matthew says sinners, he means sinners. Not like, some of the people who you talk to who they're like, you look and you see them walking with God and they volunteer at the church and they give money and they help out at the orphanage and they send off, stuff to China or whatever else, right? And you're like, wow, you really do love God. You're absolutely, you're really close to God. And they're like, I'm just a sinner. Saved by grace. Now that might be true. I'm not trying to poke at you. What I'm trying to say is that's not what Matthew means. These aren't the religious professionals who are really close to God, but then also are like, oh yeah, but woe is me, I'm just a sinner. Matthew's telling you that these people here are who everyone else looks down on, who the religious professionals would never have been a part of. In fact, this banquet would have been of the lowliest of the people, the lowliest in society, the ones who are absolutely considered the worst of the worst. Tax collectors, and anybody who likes hanging out with tax collectors. Are you getting this? Yeah. You'd be like, I hope they have a good time and choke on their fancy foods. Right? That's kind of how we end up feeling. They probably would have been among the wealthiest, but their vocations would have been considered absolutely the bottom of the barrel. They would not have been respected at all. Among this group also is Jesus' disciples. So many tax collectors, sinners, and everyone who's following Jesus. Eating with tax collectors and sinners, associating with them. At this point, you have to realize that you have the room of the people that you don't want to be around, and then the Jesus people. And it becomes no question what's going to happen next. If you even hadn't read the story before today, you knew that the Pharisees were going to show up somewhere in this, right? That somebody was going to take issue with what's going on, because after all, you had the Pharisees who knew what was good and knew what was bad, and they look in the window and see all these tax collectors, sinners, Jesus and his disciples all having a great party together. Just really having a good time. I'm going to assume. The Bible didn't actually say that. I'm making that up. But I'm pretty convinced they were. I've thought about this question for a while, and I got to tell you, we are normally pretty hard on the Pharisees. We really kind of let them have it. I'm wondering if the Pharisees' sort of question that they give us was less of an accusation at this point, as much as it could have possibly been sincere. Like, hey, really, honestly, why is Jesus hanging out with tax collectors and sinners? We today kind of look back and go, well, of course he was hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. But I want you to kind of try to transport yourself back then, where the Pharisees were trying to make sure that everybody was doing the right thing and that people were really on the right track towards God. And they look and they see, here is this big hurrah going on. And Jesus and his group are in there with tax collectors and sinners? Think about, what if this question was actually sincere? What if it was really an appropriate question? There's a couple of things we would have to take into consideration, because one is that when you share a meal with somebody, particularly in that culture, but by the way, I think it's still somewhat true today, it implies that there is a closeness to that person. But even more so back then, that closeness implies a full acceptance of that person. So in other words, this means Jesus seems to be okay with tax collectors and sinners in a way that just sort of precludes what we think we know about God. Because God is one who would not want people who take advantage of other people to be blessed, we would think, and that sinners obviously are separated from God, so this doesn't seem to be the kind of place for God people. I think that's kind of something that we would say, something we would feel. A question, by the way, that sincerely addresses a spiritual concern is always appropriate. If your brother or sister were to be doing something that you are concerned steers them away from God, would you not be willing to stop and say, hey, I just have a little concern here for you? You know, what exactly is going on? Would it please God to know that you are engaging in this? If it's a sincere question, if it's not you must be quite the sinner because I've seen what you've been doing. It's a little less sincere, right? But hey, you know, I've noticed for the last 5 nights you walk into the liquor store and walk out with a brown paper bag. And I have a little bit of a concern that that might separate you from God. Would you not want somebody to ask you those important questions? Would that not be part of what you would really hope for from a good friend? It seems like it's important, but there's also a really fine line between legalism and concern for someone else's spiritual state. I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but what I want to get us to understand here is that one of the things that's going on here is that the Pharisees, I think, have a legitimate question at hand. Why are you in a society where eating with somebody sort of implies that you guys can be great friends, knowing that that person is doing what that person is doing? How are you possibly doing what God would want you to do? I think it's important to ask. Anybody who we know who professes to be a Christ follower, and we realize that they are closely associated with sinners, we're probably going to ask the question. Unless we really don't care about their spiritual life. It's kind of a side thing. I just want to make sure. Does association with a sinner equate to acceptance of his sinful behavior becomes our difficult question. That's where we really struggle. And I think, by the way, that to a certain extent, that's the question that Jesus is going to answer. I think when he gives the answer to this very question. Is it okay to really fully do it? My point is that the question that the Pharisees ask, I think, is very sincere. By the way, if you didn't notice, it was addressed to the disciples. So, why does your teacher do what he's doing? Why are you associating with these sorts of people? Why would your teacher even allow this? And so the disciples probably were standing there with a really uncomfortable body expression, right? Like, ooh. But fortunately, Jesus heard the question too. So Jesus answers. Jesus tells them, did I skip a slide? I skipped something. Jesus speaks to the mission rather than to the morality. Jesus doesn't say, you're right. I've come and I've shared a meal now with these tax collectors, and as soon as we've finished with dessert, I'm really going to let them have it. I'm going to address that they are tax collectors and sinners and among the most lowly people that we have. Doesn't say that. And if you read on the passage, it never gets to the fact that he ever does anything like that. He goes on to say, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. This is about the mission. It's not about the morality. It's about the mission. It's not about the actions of the people that he's eating with. It's about what he's there to do. That it's no longer about whether or not they are able to uphold the law perfectly. It's about whether or not they have the ability to interact with Jesus Christ. This is good stuff. This is you should be excited here. It's healthy who need a doctor. It's the sick. I don't know why this is. The teacher, that would be Jesus, for those of you following along, says, Pharisees, I want to give you something to learn. I want you to learn a little bit about a scripture passage that, by the way, the Pharisees should have known quite well. I know that most of you, as we read it, went right away. Yep, there's Hosea 6:6. I see it right there. Maybe not. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, is a direct quote from Hosea 6:6. So what Jesus says, go find out what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Figure this out. And then come back and we'll have our conversation. Jesus sort of shuts them up with what he said. I'm pretty convinced because the story ends, right? They walk away. Life goes on. Obedience, which is what we could change out for sacrifice, or mercy. Mercy, I want to define as efforts to reconnect people to their God. So sacrifice, which I think is not just obedience, but a perfect obedience, is one option. Mercy, any effort to reconnect people to their God, I think is the second option. He says, go figure out what this means. I desire mercy more than sacrifice, is really what he's saying. That's what God wants. He's not interested in just mere obedience. What he really wants is for us to lead other people to him. I think that's one of the things that we find really important. And by the way, I think this is a real challenge for holiness people. And if you are a member of the Church of the Nazarene, or you've been around the Church of the Nazarene for a long time, you know we are a holiness people. We want to live a holy life. And the Church of the Nazarene is filled with histories where it was like, oh, we can't do that. That could be considered sin. You can't be in a swimming pool with somebody of the opposite gender because, you know, people get pregnant in those. We got to be careful. We, by the way, do need to be careful about the kinds of dance we engage in. But you know what? That doesn't make all dance evil. Legalism looks at something and goes, if it's bad in one condition, it must be bad in all the conditions. We'll just stay away from it all. And guess what? That's, I think, what the Pharisees were trying to say. Those people are worthless, Jesus, because they are the tax collectors and the sinners. Do you not know who you're hanging out with? Pretty soon you're going to be a tax collector too, Jesus. The calling for us is not legalism, by the way. It is not separationalism. The calling for us is to figure out the difference between sacrifice and mercy. I just go on. I'm preaching sermons within sermons if I'm not careful. Matthew is obedient to God, and he is, by the way, at the center of God's acts of mercy. Matthew, the lowly tax collector, the guy who was taking advantage of people, the guy who everybody looked at and said, woe is you, man. I don't even want to walk on the same side of the street as you. The kind of person that if you saw him at the entrance to the market, you probably said, today's not my day to go. Matthew is right there at the line of obedience and mercy. Front and center of watching Jesus do what Jesus does best. And this particular day, that was reclining at the dinner table with the most despised and outcast in society, of which actually he was part of. Right there in obedience and mercy. Matthew continues to walk with Jesus over the following years. He's a witness to Christ's death. He writes a book about it. You might have heard. It's called Matthew. What do we learn from the cross of Levi, or we could say the cross of Matthew? A couple ideas. First one is this. Matthew shows us that the most despised can become among the inner circle of God himself. Now, I don't want to be too controversial this morning, but if you were to think of somebody or some sort of sin that to you means that there's no possible way that God could redeem that person, God is an expert at finding a way to get to those people and bringing them close to him. Right. Yeah. And by the way, I think it starts with something like this: come and follow me. Come and follow me. There has to be this willingness, but I want to make sure that everybody listening to the sound of my voice knows that there isn't anything that you can do that will disqualify you from God's mercy, God's love, God's willingness to call you into his inner circle. Right. Yeah. So if you think you have a problem, you're funny. God sent Jesus as his very being, God with us. And Jesus went and said, let me find the people who everybody hates, and I'm going to love them and bring them into my circle. Oh, this is good stuff. You should be pretty excited at this point. Because Matthew probably cheated people. He probably took advantage of them. He probably actually earned everything that people hurled at him. He probably earned the people who said, I don't even like that guy. And if I see him, I go to the other side of the street, and as soon as he passes, I spit where he walked. In today's parlance, he's the kind of guy that we would kind of, not be so sad if he got into a car accident or something. People would say karma. But God says, let me show you what this is really about. I can redeem even those people in your eyes. We have to be able to understand this. Jesus was less concerned about Matthew's past than he was about Matthew's future, which is true about us as well. Do you ever feel disqualified from God's mercy? Has there ever been a time in your life where you have felt like, I have done one thing too many and God can never really be able to come back? It's not too much. But even maybe more important, is there anyone else in your life that you have disqualified from God's mercy? I'm more fearful about the second one than I am about the first. If we have been engaged with God, we kind of get the idea that there's nothing you can do, and God continues to come back. But I worry sometimes about that second one, that we may find ourselves, whether we want to say it or not, feeling like others are just beyond where God would be able to work. Be careful, because God might use you in some of those situations. He might say, hey, I need you to go over to Levi, the tax collector's house. And you might go, Levi, the tax collector, do you realize Levi, the tax, are you sure? Yes. That's the thing. I'm not sure. Did we skip something there? Pretty sure we did. Matthew shows us that no effort. I'll go back one. Matthew shows us that no effort is demanded as a prerequisite for mercy. Jesus didn't come and say, look, Matthew, I've got this incredible offer for you. For the next 3 wonderful years, you and I can walk together. I'll teach you all about God. In the midst of this, you are going to see miracles. We may not always have a place to sleep in, but we'll generally have food to eat. And you are going to see the most incredible things, ending with Lazarus coming up out of the grave. And there's going to be some stuff after that I don't really want to tell you about till we get there. But I need you first to stop cheating people. Didn't see that anywhere, did we? Here's what I saw. Yo, Levi. Come on, man. Levi says, all right. Yep. Next thing we know, they're at Levi's house having a party with sinners and tax collectors. Guy still doesn't get it, but okay. Right? No prerequisites. The honoring banquet is less about earning mercy. Jesus isn't saying, look, I'll give you mercy, all the mercy you want, if you will throw me a party. But I'm convinced that Matthew already recognizes that he is in the midst of an incredible act of mercy from God and wants to celebrate it. I think that's part of what's going on there. Levi doesn't have to prove himself to become Matthew. It's simply a gift of God. And that same thing is true of us today. Have you ever felt the need to earn God's mercy? I think if we're all honest, sometimes we've done that. I must earn something from God in order to get something from God, because that's often how life works for us. But by the same token, do we ever expect others to earn God's mercy? Scary kind of thought. So important, though. So important for us to really pay close attention to. Matthew finds salvation not merely in his obedience. He was obedient, but he really finds his salvation in the mercy of Jesus, who, by the way, is the one who made the call. The one who said, follow me. I've wondered, what would Matthew or Levi's cross look like to you? I've spent a lot of time this week kind of imagining, he's a tax collector, which means that he's probably among the more wealthy. And so if I were to try to find a cross that would match what I think of as Matthew, would it be like ornate? But then I also know that he kind of left that life behind and walked with Jesus, and that was the most important thing in his life. And sometimes then I think, it must have been more along the lines of something more plain and ordinary. There's supposed to be a picture showing up. There it is. The issue is that in the end, I cannot figure out what mercy looks like. what grace that leads Jesus to find Matthew, the most despised and hated person probably in the room, and say, "You're the one I want next." Can we really even describe it? Can we really even find words that tell us that this is what the cross of Jesus looks like? We know that it's these pieces, and if you realize that Jesus was nailed to a cross, it becomes this incredible tool of death, but then we Christians see it as this incredible tool of glory, hope, and love. And if we were to think of Matthew's situation and begin to think of the cross as mercy, for him, for us, for everyone around us, what does that cross look like? What does that begin to be? Because it's so difficult for us. What's your mercy symbol today? What describes mercy most to you? I think most of us can easier say that we have experienced it than describe it. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your mercy. We thank you so much for your love for us that leads us to this cross where it doesn't matter how worthy we are. It doesn't even necessarily matter how obedient we are. What matters is that you show us mercy. Dear Lord, we thank you so much. If there's anyone in this room this morning or anyone listening to the sound of my voice online who feels like you are beyond mercy, I want you to remember Levi the tax collector who becomes Matthew, the great disciple of Christ. May we just merely love on everyone around us. Be willing to show God's mercy even when it might mess with our morality. And may we just continue to go closer and closer to God. That we would begin to even see more and more the cross as a much deeper symbol than perhaps we've been thinking in the past. Pray all of this in the most wonderful name we know, in the name of Jesus. And all God's people said, Amen.
Thanks for watching this sermon with me. If you enjoyed your time with us, we'd invite you to join us in person for a service. Visit us at desertgrace.org or give us a call at 928-305-1132 for more information.